Adiós, Eva.
Hasta el lunes, buen fin de...
Igualmente.
Derroteros.
Pásalo bien.
Camino y dirección, medio tomado para llegar al fin propuesto.
Conjunto de datos que indican el camino para llegar a un lugar.
Bueno, ¿qué? ¿Nos vamos?
Dirección que se da por escrito para un viaje de mar.
Paséis buen fin de.
Libro que contiene un derrotero.
Hasta luego.
Línea marcada en el mapa de mareas para guiar a los pilotos.
Derrota.
O rumbo.
Derroteros. Derroteros.
Derroteros.
Rebeca Solnit, ¿cómo estás? How are you?
Muy cansado.
A long trip, un viaje largo.
Yes, but wonderful people, wonderful audiences. Interesting to see my work circulate beyond my own country. So, and beautiful city parks.
Pues hablando de circular y de viajar, ¿te parece que esta conversación la hagamos dando un paseo?
Sometimes it is a wonderful walk through ideas, and I understand my own ideas better. Yesterday, for example, I used again the example of Terminator 2, one of my favorite movies, because it has a strong female lead and they talk about how the future is not yet written, no fate but what we make. And then I realized when they made that movie, Arnold Schwarzenegger had no idea he would become a climate activist. And so that was a future on top of that movie that was unwritten. And not to praise Arnold Schwarzenegger more than he deserves, but, it was a beautiful example of unpredictable futures.
Sí, es un muy buen ejemplo de El camino inesperado, el libro que nos ha traído hasta aquí. ¿Por qué te interesan esos caminos no previstos?
The English title, No Straight Road Gets You There, I thought of as being about those paths that get you over the mountain through the forest to see things you can't see, going 90 miles an hour in your car, that are often the important things, the things that tell you where you really are, the things you can see if you're not in a rush, if you take the back roads. But the unexpected way, I think, is also helpful because a lot of passivity in public life comes from assuming we know exactly what to expect, but history produces surprises regularly, which in retrospect people forget were surprising. But that reminder, I think, is really helpful in that you do what you can, but you can't assume you know how it will, contribute.
Hablabas de la historia y yo últimamente le doy muchas vueltas a la frase podemos aprender de la historia para no repetirla. Porque creo que tiene una trampa, una paradoja. Parece como que el futuro estuviera escrito ya como un destino en el pasado. ¿Cómo escapamos a esa trampa y qué podemos aprender de lo inesperado del pasado para aplicarlo en el futuro?
And one of the things we learn from the past is to expect surprises, but not on schedule. So there's that. And we can learn from the past also that ordinary people come together as movements, as campaigns, as civil society, can change the world, can topple dictators, and have before. And that doesn't mean we know exactly what will happen. It doesn't lock us into a future that looks like the past. But it gives us some equipment to create that future that I think is important. I think hope is very much tied to memory, and a certain kind of despair comes from amnesia. I often hear Americans say, we never win, we have no power, it's too late, there's nothing we can do. And of course the mainstream likes to pretend that all power resides in the hands of a few, the famous, the rich, the highly visible public figures, the elected politicians, when in fact ordinary people come together, have tremendous power, which of course is proven by the ways in which they fear us and try to prevent that. And for example, in England, they're imprisoning people for climate protests in really extreme ways. And so helping people understand a different version of history than the mainstream one that doesn't tell enough about popular power, and really a different form of news. For example, being here in Europe, I've been told, why is no one in America resisting? And of course, so many people are resisting in so many different ways. And it's interesting Why do some things become visible? Why do some things remain invisible? How do we change the story, which is often about changing who tells the story and who we listen to?
Pues precisamente es esa desesperanza la que ha llevado al segundo mandato de Trump, y era previsible que saliera elegido.
I went through last autumn of 2024 not believing my country was good enough to elect a black woman, not believing it was bad enough to elect an orange man. And so I just knew that I didn't know what would happen. I actually went to 3 different states to campaign against Trump. And then we found out on the night of November 5th what the outcome was. There was a survey a few weeks ago that asked Americans how they would vote now. And a lot more people who voted for Trump would change their vote than voted for Kamala Harris. But the really significant thing, because a third of the voting public did not even show up, a lot more of those people would have shown up to vote. It was a very close election. And so if they had understood what we understood beforehand, because for those of us who are what we call news junkies, who have really good media sources, who pay a lot of attention, we knew exactly what was going to happen. But a lot of people were uninformed or misinformed, not only by right-wing media, but by mainstream media, which really normalized and downplayed the threat of Trump, or normalized Trump and downplayed the threats. For example, was a far-right plan to destroy the country called Project 2025. And Trump kept saying, I have nothing to do with that, which was clearly a lie. But the mainstream media pretend they're objective by by giving him the benefit of the doubt, by not exploring enough all the connections, by not saying this is what will happen to immigrants, this is what will happen to the economy, this is what will happen to the environment if he's elected. But some of us knew, and now it's all happening, and we're resisting.
Incluso el New York Times pidió respeto por los votantes de Trump. ¿Está de acuerdo?
The New York Times is sometimes seen as liberal or just as this very distinguished and reliable source of information. But it's constantly pandering to the right, treating them very nicely, making them look less evil, destructive, crazy, lawless than they are. And some of that, I think, is because of fear of the right. Some of that is because historically newspapers tried to treat Democrats and Republicans, left and right, equally, which when they're not that different, when they're both respect the law, when they're both reasonable parties with differences makes sense. But when one party has actually become a psychotic cult of authoritarianism, sanewashing, which is a new word created last summer, and normalizing is really participating in the propaganda and the lies. And a lot of us hate the New York Times for doing that so extensively. And Donald Trump would give speeches about the long dead golf champion Arnold Palmer's penis size, the fictitious cannibal Hannibal Lecter in the movie The Silence of the Lambs. And they'd report, he said this about the economy and this about immigration, but not that he talked for 90 minutes. And, so he was so much crazier and more dangerous than a lot of people understood because they were buffered from it by the media they absorbed.
Sí, de hecho, aquí también, leyendo el New York Times, uno tiene la sensación de que es muy poco claro respecto a la condena de lo que está sucediendo en Gaza. En España la opinión mayoritaria es de que hay una respuesta desproporcionada por parte de Israel, incluso hasta un 69% lo califica de genocidio. En Estados Unidos está habiendo muchas protestas, precisamente en las universidades, en contra de lo que está sucediendo en Palestina. Pero ¿por qué cuesta tanto a los medios y qué piensa de la censura que están sufriendo quienes protestan?
The right wing has constructed a trap made out of lies that pretends that to be against the Israeli government is anti-Semitic, even though Jews worldwide, many of us are against it, even though a lot of Israelis, Jewish and otherwise, are against it. And that has made people conservative about it. I think that a lot of the death in Gaza, the destruction, the bombing is well covered, but it's not all added up. People are afraid to use the word genocide in the U.S., so many people, of course the protesters, and there has been a lot of protest, do use it. And it's also something that's been striking to me that so long the mainstream newspaper pretended killing a lot of unarmed civilians trapped in a region surrounded by walls and weapons half the size of New York City was some form of self-defense, when in fact Israel, I think, is destroying its own future. It's standing in the world the safety of Jews because of the stupid people who think all Jews support the Netanyahu regime. And so there's a conventional way we tell every story as having two sides. In a way, this war is destructive of Israel as well as Palestine, the safety of Israelis as well as Palestinians. And, you know, and also to call it a war is to pretend that there are two parties fighting, whereas Hamas had one day of violence and Israel has now had almost 2 years of endless violence against civilians. Yeah, the death count, that's hundreds of times higher. So, is it hundreds? I'm bad at math when I'm tired.
Thousands.
Oh, 53,000 versus 1,200?
Yeah.
A lot more.
Mm.
And so, yeah, and every crisis is partly a storytelling crisis, I say in this book.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many storytelling crises around what's happening right now in Palestine, Israel.
Pues después de este desvío por la política vamos a volver, de hecho, a los libros en el deambular. En el pasado, pues la cartografía, podríamos llamarlo, de Rebeca Solnit, hay varios libros especialmente imprescindibles. El primero, uno que a mí me marcó especialmente, es Wanderlust, una historia del caminar, donde trazas una historia cultural del caminar con experiencias personales y un análisis de cuerpo, espacio público y género. ¿Por qué el acto de caminar es un gesto poético, filosófico y político tan central en tu obra?
I wrote that book in 2000 because I saw how much people were withdrawing from public space, from the courage to explore and wander. And this was even before smartphones meant we would look at our stupid phones to tell us what to do at every moment. But that disembodiment, that withdrawal, I thought was really a surrender, loss of the bigger world we could live in, the process of discovery and encounter that for so many writers, including me, has been part of our work. Walking, of course, is the one form of transportation most of us are born already equipped with. It costs nothing. Almost everyone who's able-bodied and free has it.
Mm-hmm.
And it can take so many forms. And it was a book sometimes narrated in the first person, but it went back into the history of the evolution of upright walking from four-legged creatures into the gender politics of cities, as you said, into the development of a passion for nature that becomes mountaineering and hiking, wandering in the countryside. That's very much connected to the birth of environmental consciousness and environmental activism, a kind of erotic walking of couples out courting or prostitutes on the stroll or gay men cruising, back before all the cruising was done on Grindr and other apps.
Yes.
Which I find a little sad, to in some ways, but then also revolution, because people, when I started writing that book, thought walking was all very nice and wholesome and, nice people taking hikes in the countryside. But, for example, the French Revolution really begins not with the storming of the Bastille, but with the march of the market women to the Versailles on foot, all those miles to bring the king and queen back and make them prisoners of the people. Walking can be a powerful political force, as protest, as march, as uprising, as revolution, as carnival. So I wanted to celebrate and draw attention to these things at a time they felt almost threatened. If we don't have free and open cities, you can almost design the possibility of revolution out of a privatized, suburbanized landscape. You can convince people their bodies are inadequate to get from here to there. I would have these people tell me, oh, that's too far to walk, about something that was maybe 4 kilometers. I got to teach a lot of people that 10 kilometers is not too far to walk. And I would talk about people who had walked. Well, there's a book by John Muir called 1,000-Mile Walk, where he walked from the Midwest to the Gulf of Mexico. Other stories of long-distance walks. So I really wanted just to kind of give us back our embodied powers to be out in the world, to discover ourselves, each other, our powers, whether it's the spiritual power of pilgrimage, the literary power of imagination and discovery while walking, or the power of people come together in protest.
Sí, no hay nada como poner
That
los
was
pies.
a very long answer.
No, it's okay. No hay nada como poner los pies en la tierra, y de hecho pienso que los que se transportan casi siempre en esas limusinas tintadas o viven en pisos altos, pues el problema que tienen para entender a la humanidad es que no pisan el suelo. Como bien decía, utiliza capítulos de la historia universal y colectiva que riman en el libro con su historia personal. ¿Qué es lo que le ha enseñado a ella a caminar?
I grew up in an era where children were, as we say in English, free range. A word also applied to chickens. As long as you were home for dinner, you could go anywhere.
Yes.
I grew up in a town that was right-wing, but magical in other ways. I could walk to the library, about a 15-minute walk to the south, but everything to the north was farmland, horses and cows, open country, oak trees and fields, mostly hilly, creeks we could play in. And so my feet got me everywhere. I had a bicycle, but I didn't use it that much. And I just grew up the way I think kids had always been until the era where we were convinced the world was too dangerous and children had to be driven everywhere or sit in front of the TV. And I think it generates confidence in exploration, a sense of navigational skill that I think people who use phones to navigate don't have, which is why I've also done 3 books of atlases with maps celebrating cities and exploration. I think and when the 2016 election campaign was going on, I had released the 3rd atlas, the New York Atlas, and I thought, why did you do this book in this terrible political moment? And then I thought, and I wrote a letter to Donald Trump I published saying, Donald Trump, you should visit New York City. Because he has lived in New York City all his life, but he's lived in towers and limousines and private airplanes. If you really go to New York City, if you ride the subway, you go to the ethnic neighborhoods, you discover that all the things the right says are terrible or dangerous, should not happen, have already happened. And New York is considered to be a great and thriving city. 800 languages are spoken in New York. It's the most diverse place in the world. I think there are 7,000 Muslim police officers. So there are so many queer people, so many undocumented immigrants, so many non-white people, and so the idea that immigrants, gay people, Muslims, diversity is a threat. Here's a city that has them all in glorious abundance, and it's thriving. So I thought the city itself disproved the whole right-wing agenda. In fact, the mayor of New York said that without the undocumented, the city would fall apart.
En muchos de tus libros, como en Wanderlust o tu memoir Recuerdos de mi inexistencia, el cuerpo de la mujer aparece como territorio político. ¿Cómo lo vives tú como escritora y como caminante?
One of the joys of getting older is that most of the sexual harassment has ceased. But it's really almost like an initiation rite that happens to young girls to tell them this is not their world, they're not safe in it. Men think they have the right to harass them, threaten them, possibly rape or even murder them. And it happens enough that it is something most women consciously or unconsciously factor into how they move through the world. And that's really what made me a feminist. I grew up in a family with male violence, thought I had escaped violence when I left at 17, and then discovered a world, first in Paris and then in San Francisco, full of strangers sexually harassing me. So male violence was not not in the house. In that childhood, everything was safe but home, and now only home was safe and everything else was dangerous. I got sexually harassed in multiple jobs I had as a young woman. And the fact that nobody thought this was an outrage, that it demanded a human rights revolution. And feminists did, but I wasn't so connected to them then. But most people just thought women need to learn to adapt to it, mostly by surrendering their freedom. You know, don't go there, don't wear that, don't go out at this hour, don't travel alone, don't take this job, don't be a taxi driver, don't be, you know, so women were supposed to just shrink our lives smaller and smaller. There was a wonderful thing I mentioned in the book Wanderlust on the University of California, Berkeley campus. Some feminists in the 1980s, after there had been some rapes on campus, put up signs saying no men should be out after dark on the campus. And it was a shock to men to think that their freedoms should be controlled. Their freedom should be taken away because of violence against women, whereas it was the most normal thing in the world. It still happens to tell women to just surrender their freedom. And I think, obviously, women should do what they know will help them be safer, but we also need a revolution that will only be complete when it doesn't occur to men they have the right or the desire to violate women, to take away their bodily autonomy, to, you know, when they no longer feel like masculinity is somehow enhanced rather than degraded by violence, by assault, etc. So that was really the formation of my feminism. And I gradually realized in the memoir that what I have always been arguing for around race as well as gender is a world that's a democracy of voices, because this violence has always been violence against the voice, the violence that says yes or no, the voice that testifies that this happens and is believed and has legal consequences, the voice that's even allowed into the corridors of power. You know, the world not so long ago did not allow people of color or women full participation in so many arenas, did not believe women when they told these stories or blamed them for being raped or being beaten by their husbands. So a democracy of voices, I think, is really kind of my touchstone and goal.
Hablando de feminismo, en El camino inesperado constatas que el feminismo acaba de empezar. Y eso tenemos que tenerlo muy en cuenta. ¿Deberíamos ser más conscientes de que los cambios realmente radicales llevan el ritmo lento del caminar?
If you think of how old patriarchy is, and in some parts of the world, I think it goes back 2,500 years and more, the fact that we've changed gender relations and the status of women in culture and law and representation so profoundly in 60 years is not actually slow. But you have to go back to the world before the current wave of feminism begins in the 60s to understand how much it's changed. And that's another situation in which I think the long view helps us feel powerful, successful, recognizes that the change has been enormous and that, in fact, feminism has been a very successful project, obviously far from complete. But I think if you could travel back to, say, 1960 and explain to people what the world is like in terms of, you know, equality, women's participation in political and public and professional life, at changed laws, changed marriage, changed understandings of what marriage should be, ideas about consent, at, you know, women prime ministers and presidents, and I think a few countries have achieved a majority of women in parliament. I think that would be almost incomprehensible to people of that era. And you can see even women participating in the Boston Marathon in the 60s was a wild transgression. We were not supposed to do that. Women were supposed to be too fragile and weak to even run a marathon. The women who did were attacked. One of them was physically attacked. And so we have changed the world a lot. We have a lot more to do. And that's something I think in a very important way, people tell these all or nothing stories that, you know, that something has succeeded a lot, but it's deeply unfinished, that we're in the middle of the story, is hard for people to understand. They want it to be like, oh, we've achieved everything and now we're done, or we haven't achieved anything and now we're also done because we failed. And they also tend to think celebrating victory is a form of giving up, the idea that it's all over. Whereas I think celebrating victories, recognizing it's just another step on the journey, really helps people continue on the journey. I'm a lot more cheerful than a lot of the left.
Sí, es verdad que hay que recordar que esto es un camino y que cada una de las etapas que traen victorias son una esperanza para seguir caminando. Me ha interesado mucho esa reivindicación que hace desde el feminismo de la cultura de las tías, me refiero al parentesco, ¿no? Incluso habla de un concepto de antifascists, como las tías antifascistas, ¿no? ¿Qué se puede aprender de ese personaje, de ese papel que pueden jugar en la cultura feminista de cooperación, de apoyo mutuo?
I'm an aunt and great aunt 7 or 8 times over. I'm a godmother. I was an anti-nuclear activist when I was younger, and in English we talk about the nuclear family, which is just the parents and children. So I always wanted to burst through a door and say to some part of my family, I was an anti-nuclear activist and I'm here to denuclearize the family. I think particularly now that often both parents work full-time, the nuclear family puts incredible stress on everyone. And the anti-nuclear family, which is the extended family, the community, the friends who are honorary aunts and uncles, can often take the pressure off. Particularly those of us who don't have children but love the kids, have a relationship with them. So I also think aunthood can be quite subversive. It's first of all going past the linearity of genealogies and things. Aunts may have different agendas than parents. We're often the people who let the kids do things the parents don't, who bring them different perspectives, gifts that might open up the world for them. And I think that, gay uncles, bohemian aunts have been a wonderful part of a lot of people's growing up. And it's just an interesting role that I love. Motherhood comes tragically with so much judgment, expectation, burden. A lot of fathers, anything more than nothing is considered, something he should get a medal for. A woman who does less than everything should be judged and condemned for it. Motherhood is really hard, but aunthood is both magical and something that I think can take the pressure off by expanding the family. And of course, this essay was about the Auntie Sewing Squad, who made a group led by Asian American women, many of them coming from a past in the sweatshops, the maquiladoras, making clothing, who sewed 350,000 cloth masks to give to people early in the pandemic. It became this magical, radical group, very feminist, very anti-racist, very committed to mutual aid and generosity. We formed relationships with 2 Native American reservations. I helped send 2,000 winter coats to the very poor people in one of the reservations that's in South Dakota, one of the coldest places in the United States. So many wonderful things happened. And we used aunthood as a model.
Las tías y los líquenes. Porque, como muy bien recuerdas, las sociedades, el éxito de las mismas, además, es resultado más de la cooperación que de la competitividad, que es lo que dice la agenda de la derecha.
The sort of European tradition saw everything as hierarchical and or competitive or both. For example, the old understanding of a beehive was that it had a king, who they eventually figured out was a queen. But in fact, a beehive is a democracy in which the queen is just an egg producer managed by the feminist workers, because it's a female democracy. Lichen was, when they looked under microscopes in the 19th century, assumed to be a hierarchical relationship or an exploitative relationship as soon as they recognized that a lichen is actually 2 different, not just species, but kingdoms of species, an algae and a fungus. And it took a long time to understand this different model, this horizontal model of mutual aid, of collaboration. And I think one of the beautiful visions science is bringing us that aligns very much with an indigenous worldview is a recognition that the world is actually not capitalist, not social Darwinist, not competitive in the way people think, but deeply collaborative. If there were no wolves, the rabbits would overrun the world. If, that that the trees feed the lichens help the trees, that a forest is actually a communicating and sharing community, not a bunch of individual trees competing with each other. And I think that's so interesting. If you understand that nature is collaborative, generous, full of mutual aid, full of different species that depend upon each other, then I think that changes everything, because we often justify capitalism, exploitation, selfishness, individualism by claiming it's natural. And that's based and always has been on a profound misunderstanding of nature. And so science is very much telling a different story than capitalism now. And finally, telling very much the same story many indigenous people around the world have told a story in which we live in reciprocity with nature, in which maybe the word reciprocity, which is about giving back, is better than responsibility, which sounds dreary, in which we can never be separate from nature. I find all those stories by Silicon Valley billionaires of trying to live forever or, colonize other planets.
Yes, the space.
Are almost stories about refusing to accept that we are biological beings,
Yes.
that the earth is huge and abundant if we don't destroy it, that we can't really survive anyplace else or even build a spaceship that could survive for any length of time. The wonderful microbiologist Lynn Margulis laughed at the television show Star Trek because she said you couldn't have these human beings zipping all over the universe without all the other species that contribute to our survival. In fact, one of the beautiful things we now understand is that our bodies are communities. Half the DNA in our bodies is not human. 70% of our bodies is water. We are the descendants of millions of generations that shaped our DNA and, ourselves. We couldn't live for more than a few minutes without air, a few days without water, a few weeks without food. We are now in some wonderful new biologies conceived of not as objects, but processes, because we're constantly taking in and putting out, also ideas, information, as well as, these material things. And so I find this new vision of the world beautiful and exciting and encouraging, but yet to be implemented by the power structures around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Except, although I have to say, in Colombia, Ecuador,
Yes.
New Zealand, Canada, the rights of nature,
Yes. Are recognized.
are recognized. Rivers are granted personhood and legal rights. And that moves us towards a more indigenous worldview in which everything is alive, everything has rights. And of course, my friend Rob McFarlane is on tour with his book titled Is a River Alive?
Precisamente el otro día hicimos un programa sobre eso.
Fantastic. Yeah. Actually, I was just, you don't need to, I take it you edit this podcast. You don't need to add it. But I was just at an environmental awards ceremony where an indigenous woman and her community in Peru got an award. They won personhood for their river, which they say is full of the spirits of their ancestors, sacred, alive, sentient, and deserving of protection from the oil industry and the other pollutions that were killing it and killing the people too.
Sí, esto me hace pensar en que, como dice bien en el libro, podemos aprender mucho de la naturaleza y también de las historias, y como nos contamos las historias, podemos aprender mucho de la ciencia. El problema es que a veces quien cuenta la ciencia y la historia lo hace interesadamente. Recordaba el darwinismo social, que es una interpretación totalmente errónea de Darwin, que hablaba de las personas más aptas para el ambiente, no las personas compitiendo por quién es el más fuerte. Entonces yo quería preguntarle precisamente por eso, por la importancia de cómo contar las historias. De hecho, recuerda que el discurso de Martin Luther King, I Have a Dream, fue una improvisación. Y quería saber cómo aplica ella esa improvisación y a la hora de contar historias que son tan importantes a la hora de ver el mundo.
Wandering through ideas in my imagination is like wandering through a landscape and discovering, or sometimes the walking is part of the thinking. And so, yeah, there's a wonderful story not well enough known about how Mahalia Jackson was standing next to Martin Luther King, and he had a prepared
Tell them about
speech.
the dream.
Yes, and she said, "Tell them about the dream, Martin. Tell them about the dream." The last sentence in this book, other than the acknowledgments, is actually a riff on Martin Luther King, because he wrote about that we're all united in a single garment of destiny, which is also, I think, an environmental vision as well as a moral and spiritual vision that's very beautiful. And I've been writing about him for my next book. He actually used that phrase over and over. And on election night 2024 in the US, when I realized Trump had won and that people were going to fall into despair, I wrote this credo at the end of the book, in which I wrote, remember that taking care of something else is an important part of taking care of yourself, because you are interwoven with the 10 trillion things in this single garment of destiny that has been stained and torn, but is still being woven and mended and washed.
Me parece el perfecto cierre para esta conversación, para este paseo. Solo una última pregunta. ¿Le siguen explicando cosas los hombres?
Of course they do. And when I wrote the essay, Men Explain Things to Me in 2008, I think my assumption was that men assume somehow intelligence, knowledge, expertise is inherent in the male condition and inherently lacking in the female condition. I've revised my view a little to think that some men just think it's the job of women to treat men as though that's true, whether or not it is, which is why some very silly men will explain, physics to a woman physicist, gynecology to a woman gynecologist, biology to a top woman biologist.
Mm-hmm.
I have an example of a man explaining how to train as a runner to American women who had actually won a medal in track in the Olympics. And the man was actually looking at a magazine and explaining her own training program to her. Virginia Woolf once said that women are expected to be mirrors reflecting men twice life size, and some men are quite different. Some men are very democratic, egalitarian, and you could say horizontal. Some men still expect something else. And there's a kind of incuriosity, with that man on the airplane. Why didn't he ask, oh, so you're a runner, tell me about your running? Why wasn't he interested? In which case she might be like, well, I just medaled in the 100 meters or whatever her event was. In which case he might realize there was nothing he could tell her about running because she was one of the best runners in the world.
Rebeca Solnit, it's been a pleasure walking and wandering with you. Ha sido un placer caminar y vagabundear contigo. See you next time. Hasta pronto.
Thank you.